I want to begin in Luke chapter 17 this morning, if you'd like to turn in your Bibles there, or I'll just read it to you. Luke chapter 17 and verse 26. Luke 17, verse 26, as Jesus is teaching about his second coming. He's telling us what it's going to be like. He says this, Luke 17:26, "And just as it happened in the days of Noah, so it shall be also in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating, they were drinking, they were marrying, they were being given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. It was the same as happened in the days of Lot. They were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were planting, and they were building. But on the day that Lot went out from Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all." Verse 30, it will be just the same on the day that the Son of Man is revealed, or according to the same things, literally. On the day that the Son of Man is revealed. And so what is Jesus telling us? Well, we've already looked at the fact that the days of Noah were rampant violence, everyone doing what's right in his own eyes. There was no value of human life. There was weird sexual perversion taking place in the days of Noah. And God said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever." And then he sent the flood, and he saved Noah and his family and two of every kind of animal. We've already looked at what it was like in the days of Lot. Sodom and Gomorrah, strange sexual perversion, rampant homosexuality. It was something where God said, there's not 10 righteous people left in this city. If there were 10 righteous people, God told Abraham, I'd spare the whole city of Sodom for the 10 righteous. But there weren't even found 10 righteous left in the city of Sodom. So God sent Abraham, or rather he sent two of his angels. He told Abraham what he was going to do, to go and to rescue Lot and his family. And the rest of the city was wiped out. Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities surrounding it, because of, again, rampant sexual perversion. So we know that's happening. We have violence like never before. We have the murder of unborn children, no value of human life in our culture. And our culture is the best culture in the world for valuing human life. It's far worse in other places than it is here. But even in America, we don't value human life like we once did. And we see rampant sexual perversion of all manner of things normalized in our culture, in our society. But what I wanted to point out is that in spite of the wickedness of the days of Noah and the wickedness of the days of Lot, Jesus makes a point to say everybody was just going about life as usual. It was business as usual. They didn't realize that they were about to be judged. He says they were drinking, they were eating, they were drinking, they were marrying, they were being given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. With Lot, they were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were conducting business. They were planting, so they were planting their crops and preparing to harvest their crops. They were building, but on the day that the Lord went out from Sodom, it rained down fire and brimstone. So what do we see happening today? We just had one of the biggest earthquakes in recent memory in California. A 7.1 earthquake is a big earthquake for California. It's a big earthquake for anywhere. Do we see that man is repenting and coming to God in, humility and repentance and seeking holiness and seeking to just please God and not please the flesh anymore? Do we see people crying out to God on the streets for mercy, begging God for forgiveness? Do we see that's the response of these earthquakes? No. As a matter of fact, they were popping champagne and drinking wine in Hollywood and in Los Angeles. They were celebrating the earthquake, saying, "Welcome to California." It was a big joke. It was a big excuse to party, really, in Los Angeles and in Hollywood this weekend. It's a weird thing. It's like, what does God need to do to get our attention. You have record heat waves throughout Europe. France just had the hottest June in history, in the recorded history. They had a 115-degree day. I believe it was in Paris, France. Off the charts for that part of the world. They have wildfires burning out of control throughout Europe. Alaska is baking, literally. Alaska is seeing heat like they haven't seen in a century. They are having wildfires that are just out of control in Alaska. We see floods in Siberia, floods that they haven't seen in over a century, 100 years, they say. Terrible flooding in Siberia. You know, what is it going to take for God to get our attention? You know, that hey, things aren't just honky-dory. It's not just business as usual. There's things happening. We have dolphins washing up on the shores, whales beaching themselves. Things that they can't understand, that they say this is not normal behavior for the wildlife, normal behavior for the climate, normal behavior for the things that we would expect to be seen around the world. Things are different. Things are unusual. And yet, is man turning to God? No. Man is going about his business, buying and selling, marrying and giving and marrying, planting, building houses. We're just going along like business as usual. It was a very interesting week, even before the earthquakes hit. On July 1st, they had 3 feet of snow. It was actually hail, but it looked like snow. 3 feet of hail that ended up piling up like snow in Guadalajara, Mexico. And all of the meteorologists and climatologists, they say this is unprecedented. We've never, ever seen snow in Mexico before. Not in Guadalajara. It's not that type of a climate. It's too close to the equator. And yet, you know, they had 3 feet of snow. The videos showed semi-trucks driving up to their grill through the streets. And people were just flabbergasted. They couldn't believe their eyes what they were seeing. And they said, this is highly unusual. This has never happened in recorded history. We've never seen hail like this that comes and accumulates in the feet in this part of the world. Unusual. July 1st. On July 2nd, there was a total solar eclipse. There won't be another one in this part of the world for another 250 years. They say you don't get a solar eclipse over you, but every 250 to 300 years in any given part of the world. And of course, we had a solar eclipse here in 2017 that the totality went across the whole United States, continental U.S. Very, very rare, very unusual. That was in 2017. They have a solar eclipse in South America, in Chile. And again, these are signs in the heavens to get our attention that, hey, things are happening. Things are moving. Things are shaking. God said there'd be signs in the heavens and in the stars, and the sun would be darkened and black as sackcloth. The moon would be turned to blood, and so forth. And so these things are God's trying to get our attention. That was on July 2nd. Then on July 4th, we have a pretty big quake, a 6.4 quake. I know it shook all of us up here in Tehachapi. And of course, we weren't the epicenter. The epicenter was out in Ridgecrest, about 65 miles north and a little bit east of us. But that wasn't it. There was a second quake that followed about 30 hours later that was a 7.1 earthquake. Now, for perspective, the Northridge quake was only like a 6.6 or a 6.7 earthquake. And you see the damage that the Northridge quake did compared to this quake was bigger. It was much bigger, actually. And yet again, we would expect to see all the churches in Southern California filled to capacity 2 days after a major earthquake, if people were seeking God. Now, you're here. I commend you for being here. Most of you would have been here anyways if there wasn't an earthquake. And so it's just interesting to me. It's like, what does God need to do to get our attention and to get our focus back on what really matters, back on eternal things, and to focus on heaven, focus on Jesus, focus on proclaiming the gospel, focus on living holy lives and lives that are commendable to God and attractive to men, because men are attracted to holiness and righteousness if it's done with a sincere heart of love. But, it's just like Peter said in 2 Peter chapter 3, the first part of 2 Peter chapter 3, where the people say, where's the promise of his coming and of the end of the age? Things are going to continue on as they have been from the beginning. In other words, they've been saying Jesus is going to come back for a long time and he's still not here. Well, that just means that we are ever closer to the return of Jesus Christ. It doesn't mean he's not coming back. It just means that we're getting closer and closer to the time when he does return. But all of this was predicted. All of this was predicted. I mean, in California alone, you look at us, we are the most liberal state in the nation now, neck and neck with New York politically. And when I say liberal, I mean, they're teaching sex education now to kindergartners and teaching them about homosexuality and gay sex and so forth in kindergarten, first and second grade. These are laws just passed down from Sacramento that the Assembly has passed. We have now they're saying that pastors or Christian counselors cannot counsel people to come out of a gay lifestyle. That if you counsel people to tell them that they don't have to continue in a homosexual lifestyle, or they don't have to continue as a transgender or transvestite, they could come back to their biological roots of how they were born, that this is now going to be potentially made criminal or illegal for you to counsel somebody, even as a pastor who does counseling, to tell somebody, hey, you don't have to continue in this lifestyle. Jesus has more for you. He could set you free from sexual addiction or from whatever your past was that led you into that lifestyle, the potential molestation or abuse that a child has suffered that led them into that lifestyle, because the overwhelming majority of people who identify as gay do admit that they were molested as children, and it harmed them, it damaged them, we are being told by our legislatures in California, you can't help somebody like that as a Christian from the Bible. You can't tell them that God has a way to set you free. He has a way to clean you and wash you white as snow. He has a way to give you a new birth and a new life and a new name and all of these beautiful things the gospel promises. You can't tell them that if they're gay or lesbian or transgender, if it means that they would have to stop practicing that gay lifestyle. And so, we're in California. I mean, we have the highest taxes in the nation, and all the rest. We know, we live here. That's why we live in Tehachapi, because we have a better government, local government here in Tehachapi and Kern County, thank God. But California is not a great place spiritually. We have Hollywood, we have San Francisco, I mean, you name it. We have a lot of bad stuff going on in our backyard. And has God been trying to reach California? I think he has. I think he's been trying to get California to come back to him, to turn back from him. I mean, we just got out of an historic drought. One of the worst droughts in a century. Certainly the worst drought on modern record in recent memory. It was, went on 5, 6, 7 years, depending on how you calculate it. And it was a very serious problem. Did man turn to God in repentance and humility and crying out for God's mercy during the drought? No, we just went to the government and, taxed the people more and tried to figure out a way that we were going to solve our own problem, even though we couldn't have solved our own problem. You can't, tax your way out of a drought. But God's merciful. He sent the rains, and now we're out of that drought. That didn't get our attention. What about the historic flooding that we have seen in recent years throughout California? We had this whole freeway just covered in in mud and sand over here a couple of years ago. I think it was in October of 2016. They said it was a flood that occurs every 500 to 1,000 years. Massive flood here that shut down the 58 freeway for days. There's been flooding in Santa Barbara where you had these boulders that were rolling down the hills in Montecito, smashing these $1 million mansions, boulders the size of dump trucks, and massive flooding in California, down in the Ventura area as well. So we have drought. That didn't get our attention. We have massive historic flooding. that didn't get our attention. What about wildfires? Have we seen any wildfires in California in recent years? They say it's wildfire season all the time now. They're always prepared, 12 months out of the year. We have seen the worst wildfires in history over the last few years in California. And every year the wildfires are worse than the year before. And so there's this increased frequency and intensity of these things. Has that turned us back to God? Have we repented as a nation and as a state and cried out to God? Are the churches filled with people saying, God, help us? No. Nope. Now we have, of course, the earthquakes. And what do we see? I mean, I guarantee you the people in Ridgecrest, they are reevaluating everything right now. They are reevaluating their lives. They're reevaluating their belief systems. They're reevaluating what really matters, because when you lose everything you have, then you realize that life is more than just your stuff and your things. But the rest of us, it's business as usual. Life goes on. We're eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, planting and building. And so, just like Jesus said would be the case, we are not turning to God. Now, I don't say that for us that are sitting here, obviously. But I'm saying it in general. Generally speaking, people still do not have an appetite for the things of God. They don't have an appetite for the Word of God. They don't want to hear that this is the end times. They don't want to hear that Jesus is coming back to judge the earth, because they're not serving Jesus. I'm sure that it was the mercy of the Lord that there was not more devastation from these earthquakes. You think about the little children. You think about the elderly, the widows and the orphans, and those who are the infirmed and the sick. And all of those are the ones who suffer the most during natural disasters, wherever natural disasters occur, because they need help just to get around, just to take care. They can't take care of themselves. They need help to be taken care of already. And so the Lord's mercy and His grace and His long suffering and His patience is amazing to me. People say, well, I've heard people say, well, why wasn't that earthquake underneath San Francisco, right? Or Hollywood, or Sacramento? But it's God's mercy, guys. Do you know the devastation that would occur and will occur when a big earthquake happens in San Francisco or Sacramento or Hollywood? It'll be catastrophic. If that 7.1 was transferred somewhere else into any of the populated areas of our state, there would have been mass destruction, death, injuries, and catastrophic casualties. God is so patient. He's so merciful. What does He need to do to get our attention? What does He need to do? What does God need to do to say, I'm here? Turn to me. Turn back to me. I have better for you. Obviously not a 7.1 earthquake in our backyard. Obviously that's not enough to get our attention. Obviously floods and droughts and, fires, that's not enough to get our attention in California. It makes me scared to think what it's going to take to get our attention to turn back to God. Now, related to earthquakes, I want to get a little bit of information out there, because a lot of these sermons are going out on our website. And thank you to everyone who's listening on YouTube or watching on YouTube, listening on our Spotify channel, our Podbean podcast, liking our Facebook page, all that stuff, because the sermons are getting disseminated throughout the internet, and that's what we want. We want these messages to get out there to people who perhaps will never set foot in this church, or maybe set foot in any church. And so I want to get some information out there, because this is pertinent and relevant to our time in history right now in California, related to earthquakes and what is being predicted. I have a couple of articles I want to quote. The first one was an article that I saved a few years ago. It was an article from the Washington Post, and it was from March 11th, 2015 by Abby Phillip. And I'm going to read a little bit of it to you. The article is entitled, remember this is 4 years ago in 2015, California has increasingly powerful earthquakes to look forward to. For the past century or so, California has been spared a lot of major earthquakes. In the next 30 years, that will probably change. The U.S. Geological Survey has released revised predictions for the seismic activity that Californians can expect over the next few decades. And while the USGS found that the frequency of smaller earthquakes has gone down, the risk of a significant earthquake of at least a magnitude 8.0 has gone up slightly. Quote, "We are fortunate that seismic activity in California has been relatively low over the past century, but we know that tectonic forces are continually tightening the springs of the San Andreas fault system, making big quakes inevitable," unquote, Tom Jordan, director of the Southern California Earthquake Center and a co-author of the study, said in a statement. This latest statement, the third Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, is the most advanced of its kind. Researchers used two models to make their predictions. One that predicted the likelihood that the ground would slip along California's fault, and another that predicted how much the ground would shake in a quake. It also reflects a better understanding of how seismic activity in one place might influence the likelihood of earthquakes in another place. Quote, "The new likelihoods are due to the inclusion of possible multi-fault ruptures, where earthquakes are no longer confined to separate individual faults, but can occasionally rupture multiple faults simultaneously," unquote, said the lead author, USGS scientist Ned Field, in a statement. He goes on, "This is a significant advancement in terms of representing a broader range of earthquakes throughout California's complex fault system." Speaking to the Associated Press, Field added, "California is earthquake country, and residents should live every day like it could be the day of a big one." Let me repeat that. California is earthquake country, and residents, that's you and me, should live every day like it could be the day of a big one. In 1994, the most costly earthquake in U.S. history struck just 20 miles north of Los Angeles. The Northridge quake left 57 dead and more than 5,000 injured. It was just a 6.7 magnitude quake on the Richter scale. But the damage it left in its wake is a cautionary tale. A significantly more powerful earthquake of magnitude 8.0 or more, for example, near California's more densely populated regions could be catastrophic. So this is what the scientists are saying. They're saying that there is more to come. There's more to come. And the earthquakes that are going to come are going to be bigger because we have this pressure on our plates, these tectonic plates that are rubbing against each other. They're constantly moving, one moving south, one moving north along the San Andreas fault line. Well, the fault line is where they come together, the plates, moving approximately 2 inches a year. Sometimes they get stuck, and then they release, and they shift, and they drop, or they move back and forth. And the longer it goes between major earthquakes, the stronger the earthquake will be. And this earthquake in Ridgecrest was not the San Andreas fault line. We're going to talk about the San Andreas here in a minute. Here's a second article. This is from CNN. Seismic activity along the San Andreas fault line could trigger a devastating earthquake in California by 2030. Now, this is just from yesterday. This is an article from July 6, 2019. Residents of Southern California are on high alert after a 7.1 magnitude earthquake rocked communities near the Mojave Desert on Friday, just one day after a 6.4 magnitude quake occurred in the same area. The USGS warned that another earthquake of a similar magnitude could strike within the next week, while aftershocks have occurred on average of once a minute since Friday night. Those earthquakes occurred along a fault centered near Ridgecrest, California, but it reminded geologists of the looming danger of another major quake along the imposing San Andreas fault zone to the west, which could cause significantly more damage. In the light of this week's quakes, USGS researchers are reiterating their prediction that there is a 70% chance an earthquake of a magnitude of 6.7 or higher will strike the San Francisco Bay Area along the San Andreas Fault Zone before 2030. 70% chance. That's a pretty high probability. Here's what you need to know about that massive fault zone and what it means for future California quakes. It's not a fault line, but a network. Fault lines occur where rocks on two sides push against or slide past each other, displacing the Earth's crust. Though the motion is typically unnoticeable to the naked eye, rocks continue to push but get stuck on each other's edges. Pressure builds up until stress overcomes friction, creating a sudden release of energy that sends seismic waves through the ground called earthquakes. The San Andreas Fault Zone is an 800-mile boundary between the Pacific tectonic plate to the west and the North American plate to the east. Here the plates grind past each other horizontally at a rate of about 2 inches per year, and the slight motion can cause a few smaller shocks and tremors. The fault zone isn't a single line, but a system of faults that snake throughout California, including populous areas such as Los Angeles and San Bernardino counties. The last major quake to occur along the San Andreas Fault Zone was in 1906, when a 7.9 magnitude earthquake and subsequent fire leveled parts of San Francisco and killed 3,000 people, the deadliest in U.S. history. But going more than 100 years without major seismic activity along the fault zone is an anomaly, geologists say, and could portend a massive earthquake along the infamous fault. One scientist said concerning the San Andreas fault line that we have not had a major earthquake in the southern section of the San Andreas fault line since the late 1600s. I think it was in 1680 was the last major earthquake on the southern section of the San Andreas fault line. And he went on to say when they study the history of the earthquakes on that fault, they occur on average every 120 years. So it's been 340 plus years since we've had a major earthquake on the southern section of the San Andreas fault line. And it's been over 100 years since we've had a major earthquake, the 7.9 in 1906. So that's now 115 years ago, roughly, or 120 years, almost 120 years, 1906, and 115 years or so. And so they're due for another earthquake. If there's a major earthquake every 120 years, and it's been 115 years since they've had an earthquake in the San Francisco area on that fault line, what are they telling us? It's overdue. This what we just experienced is not going to release that pressure. This earthquake in Ridgecrest has nothing to do with the pressure that is built up on the San Andreas fault line. Again, it's God's mercy. Third article from the LA Times, quickly here. Southern California is on heightened earthquake alert, with scientists saying more big tremblers are likely, perhaps over a magnitude 7.0. It was the news no one in Southern California wanted to hear. After experiencing two major earthquakes in little more than a day, one 6.4 magnitude and the other 7.1, seismologists said more significant quakes were likely, and there was even a chance of another huge trembler. Friday's quake was felt over a wide area, much of the Southland and even the Bay Area and Nevada. That got everyone's attention. But the forecast for potential for more big seismic activity has people on edge. There's a constant in earthquake science. Earthquakes make other earthquakes more likely. I'll read it again. There's a constant in earthquake science. Earthquakes make other earthquakes more likely because they're moving. The plates are moving. It's particularly obvious for a large trembler, a magnitude 7, is likely to be followed by one or more magnitude 6 aftershocks, many more magnitude 5 aftershocks, and many more magnitude 4 aftershocks, and so on. There's also another well-known relationship that there's generally a 5% chance that any particular earthquake will be followed up by something larger. That 1 in 20 odds are based on a mathematical observation scientists know. 19 out of 20 times, any particular earthquake won't be followed up by something more powerful. On Friday, we happened to be unlucky. The 8:20 p.m. magnitude 7.1 quake Friday night was a result of seismic forces that worsened following the nearby 4th of July trembler of magnitude 6.4. The chances that a future quake will surpass Friday night's magnitude 7.1 trembler are roughly 8 to 9%, said Caltech seismologist Lucy Jones. So what does that mean? I've been reading about this, as many of you probably have the last couple of days, and hearing what these seismologists and these geologists are saying. And they say right now, within the week, basically 1 week after that earthquake, we now have an 8 to 9% likelihood that there will be a bigger quake on that same fault line that just occurred. So where the 7.1 occurred, we now have basically a 1 in 11 or a 1 in 12 chance that there will be an even larger quake. Now those odds diminish over time. So the biggest risk period is the first 24 hours. As we saw after the 6.4, we had the 7.1 that followed within 30 hours or so. So the first day is where you have the greatest risk. And then it's the next couple of days. So really it's the first 72 hours where you have the greatest likelihood after a major quake that you'll have an even bigger quake, especially if you're not having major aftershocks. And then the odds diminish again. So really for about a week, we're kind of in this limbo of not knowing if there's going to be a larger quake that will result. It is entirely possible. 1 in 11 is pretty good odds. Even 1 in 12 is pretty good odds. 8 or 9%. The article continues, more likely is that the Owens Valley will experience another trembler of magnitude 6 or greater, and more quakes of magnitude 5 or greater are a near certainty. It is clearly a very energetic sequence, so there's no reason to think we can't have more large earthquakes, she said. Even a quake in the magnitude 5 range can be felt far from Ridgecrest, located near Naval Air Weapons Station, China Lake. A magnitude 5.4 aftershock of the Independence Day quake woke some people up early Friday in downtown Los Angeles, 125 miles away. The question's asked, is there a chance that this is going to trigger the big one on the San Andreas Fault? The seismologist says it's not likely. The San Andreas Fault is roughly 100 miles away at its closest point, much too far away for there to be a high chance of these recent quakes to cause the southern San Andreas to unleash a supersized earthquake. The southern San Andreas Fault is capable of unleashing a magnitude 8.2 quake throughout all of Southern California, from close to the Mexican border to Monterey. Skipping ahead, there's actually been an earthquake drought lately in California, part of the normal rhythms of seismic behavior, sometimes scarce and sometimes busy. In California, we expect to have a magnitude 7 once every 10 to 20 years. And the last one was 20 years ago, Jones said. Think of this as a return to what California is supposed to be doing. Now, what can we do to prepare? Stock up on enough food, water, and medicine to be self-sufficient for 2 weeks. Plan for your workplace to have a continuity plan when you're at work. And keep an eagle eye wherever you live or work, and imagine all the possible things that could fall on yourself, your loved ones, and your pets. Head to your hardware store's earthquake prep section to find ways to bolt bookcases down and keep large objects from falling on you when the shaking comes. And I would add, surrender your life to Jesus Christ and turn to Him for salvation so that you can have hope when these earthquakes happen, because these earthquakes are going to happen. We just don't know where or when or how big that they are going to be. And again, God is so patient with us. He's so merciful. It's like He's, it reminds me of Jesus riding into Jerusalem on the donkey and Jesus weeping over the city of Jerusalem because they rejected their Messiah as He was coming in on that day, the triumphal entry. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem," He cried, "you who stone the prophets and those who God has sent to you. I would have gathered you as a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not have me," Jesus said. And so He wept because He knew the destruction that was going to come upon Jerusalem from the Romans in 70 AD because they rejected Jesus Christ and rejected their Messiah. I'm sure His heart breaks because God knows the future. He's told us what's coming, and it's going to get bad. It's going to get worse for planet Earth.